Romulus and Remus were born in Alba Longa, near the future site of Rome. The twins were said to have been delivered through a Vestal virgin named Rhea Silvia, and the father being the god of war, Mars. King Amulius at the time saw the brothers as a threat to his rule and had them killed. The servant that was ordered to do the deed, however, couldn't, and left the boys on the bank of the Tiber River, and they didn't succumb to death. Instead, their lives were saved by the god Tibernus, and the boys were raised by woodpeckers, wolves, and deer. This period in their lives were where the famous iconography of the two suckling from a she-wolf is derived. This imagery would be a staple in Roman culture, considering the first record of this occurrence was in the 3rd century BC, and it continued beyond the 15th century AD. Romulus and Remus grew up as humble shepherds after being adopted by one named Faustulus, never knowing where they'd come from or the potential that lay within them. Over time, however, they did attract followers with their natural sense of leadership and responsibility. In their young adult life, they had gotten in the middle of a conflict between former King Numitor and his brother who he had displaced, Amulius. During this time, Remus had gotten captured and was on his way back to Alba Longa as a prisoner because the king had become suspicious of Remus's lineage. Meanwhile, Romulus formulated a plan to rescue Remus, and it was at this time the two brothers learned of their prophetic past. They teamed up with their grandfather and together overthrew Amulius and reinstated Numitor as the king of Alba Longa. After this victory, the twins sought out to establish their own land. The only problem was where it would be. Remus preferred the Aventine Hill, Rome's southernmost hill, while brother Romulus wanted to build on Palatine Hill, where the boys grew up so long ago. This sparked a contest of augury, or interpreting omens by birds and their flight patterns. Remus first saw 6, but then Romulus saw 12, and claimed to be chosen by divine approval. This won Romulus the spot on which Rome would be found, but it also drove the brothers apart. This divide would come to a head when Romulus, or one of his supporters, had Remus killed. This made it possible for the brother to become the first of 7 kings of Rome. In his reign, he would instate the military, the government, and religious traditions. As just stated, the religious and superstitious nature of Romans and people in general at the time cannot be overstated. Major decisions would be made this way, kings would be instated, wars would even be led by these titans that Romans worshipped. Even factual history would be intertwined with the mythological, blurring the line of what did and what did not happen. After Romulus, a procession of kings would rule Rome. Each rule would last about 35 years. Numa Pompilius would be the second king after the death of Romulus. He was his brother-in-law, but wasn't given the throne because of it. He had to earn it, and was elected by the Curiate Assembly, a group of 30 Romans whose job it was to elect new kings and to vote on some laws. This reign lasted from 716 BC to 672 BC, the year of his death at 80 years old. Tullus Hostilius was third, again elected by the Curiate Assembly, and unlike his predecessor, he was warlike and less democratic. He ruled from 672 BC to 642 BC, following the death of Numa. He was the great-grandson of Romulus, and according to Levi, a Roman historian, Tullus didn't observe religious rituals and thought very little of spiritual observances. He believed religion was below a king, and prophetic events began occurring, such as a hail of stones that fell from the Alban Mount. After that, a loud voice came from the Alban, complaining that the citizens had lost their way of fellowship of the gods. Pestilence struck in Rome, and Tullus became ever more superstitious, culminating at the point where he researched suggestions from Numa for sacrifices to the god of the sky and lightning, Jupiter. When the sacrifice wasn't carried out sufficiently, Tullus and his house were struck down in a display of lightning from the angered god, leaving only ashes. Ansus Marcius was the 4th king of Rome, whose role lasted from 642 BC to 616 BC. The first act of the new king was to have the commentaries of Numa duplicated and put on display so that religious rites and rituals would never again be neglected nor improperly carried out. Ansus was also responsible for Roman victories and extensions of the empire by waging war against the Latins at Medulia. With his victory, he brought back loot and Latin settlers. He also constructed a wooden bridge that connected the Tiber to the Janiculum, a hill just outside the original borders of Rome, and there built a fortification and Rome's first prison, the Mamertine Prison. He would also go on to spread the Temple of Jupiter to reflect Rome's extending reach. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus became regent due to Marcius's son being too young. He was the first Etruscan king and was also known as Lucumo. His reign lasted from 616 BC to 578 BC. Lucius came to Rome from Etruria with his wife to find political advancement where he could find none in his homeland due to his Greek bloodline. It is said by the historian Levi that upon entering Rome, an eagle swooped down, took his hat off his head, and came back down to return it. This was, as prophesied by his wife, an omen to his power and success. Not long after arriving, Lucius's courtesy had drawn the eye of the king, and he was given the job of guardian for the nobility's two sons. Lucius, upon the king's demise, used his status to convince the council to overlook the sons in favor of himself as the new king. Unfortunately, the boys were away on a hunting trip and could not defend their side, and Lucius was made king. His reign saw an attack from the Sabines, who had received auxiliaries from 5 Etruscan cities. The war was won by Rome, but only after violent fighting in the streets. The spoils of war, however, saw Rome's borders again spread to the cities of Corniculum, Old Fusilia, Cameria, Crestirium, Amerolia, Medulia, and Nomentum. Not only that, but Lucius is said to have built the first Circus Maximus at Rome for the purposes of chariot racing. As with the wars he waged and won, he also knew how to celebrate. In Etruscan fashion, he would ride down a golden chariot drawn by 4 horses, and wore a toga that was adorned with golden thread. He would be the first to instate many items of military and governmental fashion, including a ring, a purple garment, and a tunica palmata, a tunic embroidered with palm leaves. Servius Tullius, the 6th king of Rome, was the son-in-law of Priscus, and seized kingship after Marcius's son had Priscus assassinated under the guise that he was merely filling in while the real king was unable to rule. This reign began in 578 BC and ended in 534 BC with his untimely death. In life, he was a king favored for his military success in Veii and the expansion of the empire. He also built a temple for Diana, the goddess of nature, animals, and the moon. Fortuna, the goddess of luck, also saw a temple built in her honor. One of his more disputed achievements is the minting of the first real coinage in Rome. But another very real accomplishment of this king was supporting the growth of the commoner classes of Romans and non-Romans alike, strengthening the empire with more land and people. This could not, however, save him from his murder by his daughter Tullia and his son-in-law Superbus, who would become the next and last king of Rome. As Tullius died, so did the last king to hold the gods in high regard. He, like those before him, generally believed these gods to hold powers and the ability to change or sway fate. Kings as well as commoners would congregate to temples built to old gods and new. To understand these deities and their roles is to understand the thoughts, values, and logic of the ancient Romans. Jupiter was the king of gods, his domain was the sky, and he was the god of thunder and lightning. The bolt was his attribute, and he used it as a weapon to unleash his righteous fury on the world. His animal was the eagle, which he used as his messenger. Jupiter is also the father of many Roman gods, and playing both husband and brother to Juno. He was generally thought to have a bad temper, and would lash out against mortals on a whim. This was the god kings tried their best to keep happy to secure his allegiance in war and politics. Juno was the queen of the gods. She was known as the protector of the Roman state and the guardian of the empire's wealth. Juno represented a matriarchal figure to all of Rome and birthed two of its gods, Vulcanus and Mars. She was also the benevolent goddess to which poor and needy Romans prayed to. The month of June gets its name from this goddess. Minerva, goddess of education, art, and knowledge, also ruled over industry, medicine, and dyeing. This goddess was most important to scribes in Rome's wealth of architects, orators, and artists. She was celebrated on the spring equinox every March with a festival. Vesta was the goddess of fire and the hearth. Her animal was the ass, and she was patroness of bakers, and was one of the most worshipped of the gods. Ceres, worshipped by farmers and shepherds, was goddess of agriculture, grain, and the initiator of civilization. She was the protectress of motherhood, marriage, and women. She was the lawgiver, and the love mothers have for their children. She was the mother to Persephone, and her worship included fertility rites. Diana was the goddess of nature, the moon, the hunt, goddess of creatures, mountains, and forests. She is portrayed as having a bow and arrow, and having a dog or stag at her side to represent her ties to nature. She is known for her athleticism and beauty, hunting ability, and strength. Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, also claimed gardens and vineyards as her domain. Mars was the god of war, but he also played a part in the god of nature. He was considered the father of Rome because he was the father of Romulus, the founder of Rome. Because of that and his warlike tendencies, he was the most prominent god with military legions and worshipped primarily by men. He was also known to be the god of anger, terror, courage, and revenge. All these things, which Rome held so critical in their expansion, made Mars second in importance only to Jupiter. Mercury was the god of commerce, trade, money, and travelers. His attribute was a staff that was adorned with two intertwined snakes, and a purse that exemplified the importance of his role in his appearance. On his day, shop owners would sprinkle water on their money and merchandise in order to bless it. Neptune, the god of the sea and of earthquakes. This god also ruled over horses and horse races. His attribute is the trident. Vulcanus, the god of fire, blacksmiths, and craftsmanship. It is said that he dwelled under Mount Etna, where he forged weapons for gods and heroes. The symbol of this mighty worker was the blacksmith's hammer. Along with Mars, this god was one particularly special to armies and warriors. Apollo was a son of Jupiter, and the god of music, which he displayed by playing a golden lyre. He also had archery skills, brandishing a silver bow. And he was the god of healing, being the god responsible for teaching man about medicine. He was also the god of truth and light. His most important job was to drive a 4-horse chariot across the sky to usher in the sun each day. Knowing the personalities and attributes of each of these gods were a priority to any Roman who wished to pray to a certain god or goddess, depending on what they needed. To some, these rituals and deities were a waste of time. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus was the 7th and final king of the Roman Empire. He began ruling in 534 BC, and the end of his rule in 509 BC would mark the end of the period of kings. His rule is shrouded in myth and legend, but what is known is that he killed several family members to reach the throne, including his wife, elder brother, and predecessor. His reign was taxed by military failure, such as the failed siege on Rutuli, which threw him into a chasm of drinking and public ire. All of this failure and tyrannical behavior hit its peak in 509 BC, when there began an uprising which resulted in the Roman Republic, the republic that Servius Tullius had laid the groundwork for, the republic that would herald a new chapter of history for Rome. In 450 BC, the first law codes were written on bronze tablets and put on display. These tablets were known as the 12 Tables and would influence the next 150 years of lawmaking in this new republic. These laws covered everything from civil disputes and property to capital punishment and the penalty for claiming false witness. That punishment was to be hurled down from the Tarpeian Rock. As much as these laws helped give structure to the ever-growing Rome, they couldn't prevent the sacking of Rome in 390 BC by the Gauls. They scorched the Republic, but with the wise military leadership of Camillus, Rome found its way back to growing in terms of land and people. With this growth, there also arose a divide in society. By 300 BC, Rome was heavily ruled by patricians, wealthy Romans who are said to be descendants of Romulus himself, and plebeians, commoners. But only commoners who were wealthy enough to be considered worthy or valuable. By 264 BC, the mighty reach of Rome had spread to the Italian peninsula and fought in a series of war with Carthage, a North African city-state known as the Punic Wars. Unfortunately for Carthage, Rome won the first war and in the spoils claimed Sicily, the western Mediterranean, and most of Spain. While Rome was enjoying its seemingly non-stop growth, a storm was brewing across the Alps that would shake the Republic. In 218 BC, arguably the most admirable and daring achievement of ancient warfare was executed. The son of a Carthaginian general of the First Punic War, Hannibal, planned his retaliation on Rome from the war that cost him his homeland. He was a lethal combination of intelligent and daring, called by some to be the greatest military commander in history. He would lead an army which included war elephants from Iberia, over the Pyrenees, and the Alps into Italy. The elephants on which his army rode became a symbol more than an effective weapon. While they were wild animals prone to lashing out unexpectedly, they were also giant gray monsters that Romans had never seen before. The biggest animal the average Roman ever saw likely would have been a horse, and then comes over the Alps a band of them, double the height of any man, leathery gray skin, large white deadly tusks, and a call that rang out through Italy upon Hannibal's arrival. To instill his enemies with further fear and intimidation, he trained a few of the elephants to crush underfoot captured soldiers, a slow and agonizing death that broke every rib and ruptured several organs. There he won 3 dramatic victories, the Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae. Possibly his strongest attribute was his ability to evaluate himself and his enemy and plan any battle according to those advantages. Using this technique, he defeated many allies of Rome and occupied much of Italy for 15 years, though never setting foot in Rome. A counter-invasion from Africa forced Hannibal back to Carthage, defeated at the hands of Scipio Africanus at the Battle of Zama. This defeat would turn into voluntary exile, and only one more outstanding naval victory against a fleet from Pergamon before he would be betrayed to the Romans and commit suicide by poisoning himself. In the Third Punic War from 149 to 146 BC, Carthage fell to its knees and became a Roman province. The citizens of Carthage were sold into slavery, and the land dissolved into the body of the Republic. At the same time, Rome was spreading its influence east, defeating King Philip V of Macedonia, and it too became a Roman province. Besides expanding its massive republic, the conquest would expose Rome to Greece, a culture rich in writing, religion, art, and philosophy, things Rome didn't have that much of yet. Most of Greece's knowledge would be translated from Greek to Latin, but it would be centuries before Rome would finally assimilate Greek culture into its own.